Most people think budgeting is the solution. Spend less, track your money, cut unnecessary expenses. And at first that sounds completely reasonable. Because if financial stress comes from money leaving too quickly, then controlling spending should solve the problem. That's the logic most people are taught from the beginning. And to be fair, budgeting can absolutely help people organize financial behavior more clearly. But there's a reason so many people repeatedly start budgets, only to abandon them weeks or months later. Not because they're lazy, not because they're unintelligent, and not because they don't want it badly enough. The deeper issue is that budgeting often treats financial stress like a math problem, when much of financial behavior is actually behavioral, emotional, environmental, and systemic. And when a system-level problem gets treated like a spreadsheet problem, frustration usually follows. Because people begin blaming themselves for failing systems that were never designed around how human behavior actually works. This is Streetwise Wealth Academy. I'm Winston, your synthetic financial educator. This content is educational commentary only and is not personalized financial advice, so always research financial decisions carefully. One of the most important things to understand about money is that financial behavior does not happen in isolation. People do not make decisions inside perfectly controlled environments. They make decisions while stressed, while tired, while distracted, while overwhelmed, while surrounded by systems specifically designed to encourage spending behavior continuously. And once you understand that clearly, budgeting begins looking very different. Because budgeting assumes something extremely important. It assumes awareness automatically creates behavioral consistency. But awareness and behavior are not the same thing. Most people already know they should spend less money in certain areas. That information alone usually isn't the issue. The issue is that behavior is heavily shaped by environment, repetition, convenience, emotion, and normalization. And modern financial systems are extremely effective at influencing all of those things simultaneously. That matters because human beings naturally adapt to their environment over time. If spending becomes easier, spending frequency usually increases. If convenience improves, resistance decreases. If friction disappears, awareness often decreases alongside it. And modern financial systems are heavily optimized around friction reduction. Subscriptions remove recurring purchase awareness. One-click purchasing removes hesitation. Monthly payment structures reduce emotional resistance to larger costs. Automatic renewals remove repeated decision-making entirely. Deferred payment systems separate emotional satisfaction from immediate financial impact. And all of these systems influence spending behavior quietly over time. Not because people are irrational, because human behavior consistently follows the path of least resistance. Now this is where budgeting becomes psychologically difficult for many people. Because budgeting often asks individuals to continuously resist systems specifically designed to reduce resistance. That creates exhaustion over time, especially when budgeting is approached through restriction alone. Because restriction without structural understanding often feels emotionally unsustainable. At first, motivation exists. People track spending carefully. They monitor purchases closely. They try to stay disciplined, and for a short period of time, things often improve. But eventually, emotional fatigue begins appearing. Small exceptions begin feeling justified. Convenience slowly returns. Tracking becomes inconsistent. And eventually, the system drifts back toward previous behavior patterns. Not necessarily because discipline disappeared completely, but because behavior gradually returned to its normalized environment. And normalization is extremely powerful. Because once something becomes emotionally normal, resisting it continuously requires increasing amounts of mental energy. That's why budgeting often feels easier in theory than in reality. The spreadsheet itself is usually not the difficult part. The difficult part is sustaining behavioral friction inside systems optimized for convenience and emotional spending. Now another important issue appears when people begin viewing budgeting as punishment. Because many people unconsciously associate budgeting with financial failure, restriction, loss, embarrassment, and that emotional framing changes behavior significantly. If budgeting emotionally feels like punishment every time it is used, people naturally avoid engaging with it consistently. That doesn't mean budgeting itself is inherently negative. It means emotional association shapes long-term sustainability, and emotional sustainability matters far more than short-term intensity. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings in modern financial culture. People often believe extreme discipline creates lasting financial stability, but extreme systems frequently collapse because they depend on continuous emotional intensity. And emotional intensity is difficult to maintain long-term. Human beings naturally seek equilibrium, so systems requiring constant psychological strain eventually become difficult to sustain consistently. That's why many budgeting systems work temporarily, but fail behaviorally across years. Now there's another layer underneath this that becomes even more important, because budgeting often focuses heavily on visible spending, while ignoring invisible financial pressure. And invisible pressure shapes behavior constantly. Stress influences spending, fatigue influences spending, lack of time influences spending, emotional exhaustion influences spending, and modern life creates significant amounts of all four simultaneously. That matters because convenience spending is often not purely about irresponsibility. It's frequently about energy management. People under pressure naturally prioritize reducing friction wherever possible. Faster food, delivery services, subscriptions, convenience purchases, small comforts that reduce emotional exhaustion temporarily. And individually, many of those decisions feel completely reasonable in the moment they happen. That's the important part. Financial systems rarely become difficult through one catastrophic decision. They usually become difficult through accumulated normalization of small, friction-reducing behaviors repeated consistently across time. And budgeting alone often struggles to address that deeper behavioral structure, because the spreadsheet records behavior after it already happened. It does not automatically change the systems influencing the behavior beforehand. Now this is where many people become discouraged financially, because they repeatedly attempt to control outcomes, without fully understanding the systems shaping those outcomes, and repeated frustration eventually changes identity. People begin saying things like, "I'm just bad with money," "I have no discipline," "I can never stick to budgets." But identity-based conclusions often emerge after repeated system friction, not necessarily because someone is incapable of improvement. And this distinction matters enormously, because if people misunderstand the source of the problem, they usually apply pressure in the wrong direction. More guilt, more restriction, more intensity, more emotional frustration. But increased emotional pressure does not automatically create sustainable systems. Sometimes it creates avoidance instead. Now, none of this means spending awareness is unimportant, and it certainly does not mean budgeting has no value. Understanding cash flow matters. Awareness matters. Structure matters. But sustainable financial systems usually work differently than people expect, because long-term behavior tends to improve more effectively through environmental design than through constant emotional resistance alone. And environment shapes behavior continuously. For example, friction influences action. The harder something feels, the less frequently it tends to occur. The easier something feels, the more frequently it tends to occur. That principle affects spending constantly. And modern financial systems understand this extremely well. That's why many payment systems are designed to feel emotionally smaller than they actually are. Monthly payments instead of total cost. Automatic renewals instead of repeated approvals. Deferred payments instead of immediate financial impact. All of these structures reduce psychological friction. And reduced friction changes behavior over time, whether people consciously recognize it or not. Now, when people experience repeated financial stress inside these systems, something else begins happening psychologically. Pressure itself becomes normalized. People begin expecting stress as part of normal financial life. Get paid, handle obligations, catch up temporarily, fall behind again, repeat. And once a cycle becomes emotionally familiar enough, it stops being questioned deeply. People begin optimizing inside the cycle instead of examining the structure creating the cycle itself, trying new budgeting apps, new spreadsheets, new tracking systems, new restriction plans, but still operating inside the same larger behavioral environment. And this is where many financial systems quietly sustain themselves. Not because individuals are incapable, but because systems continuously reinforce repeated patterns through normalization and convenience simultaneously. Now, if you step back and look at the broader structure, something important becomes visible. Behavior is shaped by environment. Environment shapes normalization. Normalization shapes expectation. Expectation shapes repeated behavior. And repeated behavior reinforces financial outcomes across time, which means budgeting alone often struggles because it addresses one layer of the system, while many other layers continue operating underneath it continuously. Now, this is important because once financial behavior is viewed structurally instead of morally, clarity begins increasing. Instead of viewing every spending mistake as personal failure, you begin observing recurring environmental patterns influencing behavior repeatedly. Stress patterns, convenience patterns, normalization patterns, impulse patterns, friction reduction patterns. And once those patterns become visible, financial life stops feeling completely random emotionally. You begin recognizing that many financial systems are designed around behavioral predictability, not necessarily around long-term stability. And understanding that changes perspective significantly, because awareness creates analytical distance. Instead of reacting emotionally to every individual spending decision, you begin observing the systems influencing decisions consistently across time. And observation changes attention. You start noticing how environments influence behavior automatically, how convenience changes emotional resistance, how normalized spending quietly expands lifestyle baselines over time. And once those systems become visible, financial behavior becomes easier to understand objectively, not emotionally, objectively. Now, understanding systems does not instantly remove financial pressure, and it's important to remain realistic about that. But understanding does something else first. It changes perception. Because once systems become visible, they stop feeling completely invisible and inevitable. And awareness always begins with visibility. That's why financial understanding is not about memorizing isolated tips. It's about understanding how systems shape behavior continuously over time. And every lesson in this series builds around that same principle. Because understanding how money really works requires understanding the structures influencing behavior beneath everyday financial life. That concludes today's lesson. Peace. If this lesson helped you see money a little differently, then stay with the series. Because financial understanding is not built from one idea. It is built layer by layer. One system, one pattern, one hidden behavior at a time. This first month is focused on the financial lessons many adults were never properly taught growing up. How money moves, how debt works, how stress builds, how behavior gets shaped, and how modern financial systems quietly influence everyday life. So watch the next lesson when you're ready, and keep building the foundation. This is Streetwise Wealth Academy. I'm Winston. Peace.